In September of 1996, I inherited a small corn farm in Indiana from a distant relative I barely knew. I had met him once at a funeral when I was a kid. I remembered his face only because it looked worn down like the land he owned. When the letter came from a local attorney, I assumed it was a mistake. It wasn't. He had no close family, and for reasons I still don't understand, the property was left to me. I was 32 at the time. I worked a warehouse job in Illinois and had no connection to farming. The idea of owning land felt unreal. I drove down there with the plan already set in my head. I would stay until the corn was ready, sell the crop, sell the land, and leave. I didn't want to fix it up. I didn't want to keep it. I just wanted it gone. The farm sat at the end of a cracked county road that barely showed up on a map. Cornfields surrounded it on 3 sides, with thick woods pressed up against the back edge of the property. The house was a single-story structure with faded white paint and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. There was a small barn, old and leaning, and a rusted grain silo that hadn't been used in years. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. No nearby traffic, no dogs, no distant machinery. Just wind moving through corn and insects that seemed careful about when they made noise. It felt like the land was holding its breath. Inside the house, everything was still there. Furniture from the 1960s. Yellowed newspapers stacked by the door. Old boots by the back entrance, caked with dried mud. There was no smell of rot or mold, just dust and something sour like old grain. The power worked. The well pump worked. Everything felt maintained just enough to keep going, like the place refused to fully fall apart. I spent the first few days checking the field and making calls about selling the harvest. The corn was tall, thick, and healthy. It should have made me feel lucky. Instead, I hated walking between the rows. The stalks closed in fast. Light disappeared after a few steps. The air felt warmer in there, heavy on my skin. Every sound echoed strangely, like it came from somewhere else. Every evening, just before sunset, the crows arrived. At first, it was a few, then dozens, then more than I could count. They gathered in the same section of the field every night, about 200 yards from the house, near where the corn met the woods. They didn't spread out. They packed together on the ground in low stalks, all facing inward, like they were focused on something I couldn't see. They screamed nonstop until dark. Not random calls. It was constant, loud, sharp. It made my head hurt. When the sun dropped and the light went flat, they lifted all at once and disappeared toward the trees. I told myself crows were smart animals. Maybe there was food there. Maybe a dead animal buried under the soil. I try not to think about it. Sleeping was hard. The house made noise at night. The walls popped. The roof shifted. Sometimes I heard movement outside, slow and steady, like someone walking the edge of the field. I blamed raccoons or deer. I never looked. On the 6th night, the air felt wrong before sunset. The sky stayed gray even as the sun dropped. The wind stopped. The corn stood perfectly still, no rustling, no sway. When the crows arrived, they came faster than usual. They screamed louder, almost frantic. I sat on the back porch and watched that section of field. I don't know why I stayed. I should have gone inside. Instead, I kept looking. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a piece of equipment left standing in the field. Something tall, dark, and narrow. It stood higher than the corn, completely still. No shape I could clearly define, just a vertical form between the rows. I stared for a long time, trying to make sense of it. My eyes adjusted. It wasn't metal. It wasn't wood. It wasn't attached to the ground the way a machine would be. Then it leaned forward. It didn't bend like a person. It tilted smooth and controlled, like a tree pushed by wind that wasn't there. It moved into the corn without making a sound. No stalk snapped. No leaves rustled. It just disappeared. The crows exploded into the air at the same time, screaming as they fled toward the woods. I stood there long after dark, frozen. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard it made my chest ache. When I finally went inside, I locked every door and turned on every light. I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. The sky was pale and dull. I waited until full daylight before stepping outside. I walked straight to that section of the field. The corn was flattened in a wide path, pressed down like something heavy had passed through. The stalks weren't snapped or broken. They were bent low and crushed into the soil, all leaning in the same direction. The path led straight toward the woods. I followed it to the edge of the field. The ground that was torn up, deep impressions pressed into the dirt. Not footprints, more like long, uneven depressions, as if weight had shifted across the ground without lifting. The woods beyond were dark and thick. Branches were bent inward. Leaves were stripped from lower limbs. I didn't go in. I walked the rest of the property that day and found more signs I had ignored before. Fence posts pushed slightly out of line. Deep marks near the barn where the soil stayed packed down. Old corn from previous seasons flattened in the same area, layered and rotting like it had happened before. That night, the crows came back. I stayed inside and watched from a window. The screaming lasted longer than usual. I could feel in my teeth. When it finally stopped, I saw movement at the edge of the field. Not clear, just a shift in darkness where the corn leaned inward again. I packed my things before sunrise. I didn't finish the harvest myself. I hired a local company and stayed in a motel until it was done. I signed papers as fast as possible. I sold the farm for less than it was worth. I didn't care. I never spent another night there. Years later, I looked it up out of curiosity. The farm had changed owners twice. The cornfields were smaller now. The back edge near the woods was left untouched, grown over with weeds and brush. Satellite images showed flattened patches that appeared and disappeared between seasons. I don't think what I saw was a ghost. I don't think it was something unreal. I believe it was something living that knew the land better than I ever could. Something that moved through those fields quietly, repeatedly, long before I arrived and long after I left. I didn't inherit a farm. I inherited a place that was already claimed, and I was smart enough to leave before I learned exactly why. I went to the farm in March 2021 to help my friend document abandoned rural properties for a photography project. He had been obsessed with Eastern European ruins for years, traveling through small villages and forgotten settlements, trying to capture buildings that time had ignored. This particular farm was tucked away far from any main road, the kind of place you could pass by in a car without ever noticing it. GPS barely registered the turnoffs, and the final stretch was a narrow dirt path that had frozen over and cracked under the winter cold. The snow had mostly melted, but patches of ice and hardened mud made the drive tricky. By the time we reached the property, the sky was low and gray, the kind of gray that made the edges of things soft, almost unreal. The farmhouse itself was collapsing. The roof sagged unevenly, tiles missing, beams exposed, windows either shattered or boarded up. Every step on the front porch made a groan echo through the empty air. Inside, the floorboards were wet in places from a leaking roof, and frost had coated the windowsills. Wallpaper hung in strips, peeling like dry bark, and the kitchen still held rusted utensils scattered across a layer of dust and mold. There was an overpowering smell of damp wood, soil, and the faint trace of animals that must have passed through months ago. The barns were intact, which is why we chose to stay there. One of them had a loft and a small storage room, so we moved our sleeping bags and a few supplies inside. We had minimal gear, cameras, tripods, notebooks, flashlights, and a small portable stove. The walls were thick enough to block most of the wind, but the gaps in the siding let in drafts that made everything creak and whistle when the gusts hit. The first night was cold but uneventful. I stayed awake longer than I intended, wandering through the barn with a flashlight, taking pictures of the beams, the rusted nails, and the shadows they cast. Outside, the fields were blanketed in frost, the skeletal remains of crops from last year poking through. There was a distant hollow silence, no wind, no animals, just the echo of our own movement against the hard ground. The night felt heavier than usual, almost physical, like it pressed down on my shoulders, but I dismissed it as my imagination and the stress of travel. The second night was different. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving outside the barn. At first, I thought it was the wind. The old siding rattled in the gusts, and sometimes snow or ice would slide from the roof. But then I realized the sound had rhythm. Slow, deliberate steps circling the building. The kind of slow pacing that didn't make sense with the terrain. No slipping on frozen mud, no shifting snow. Each step was followed by a pause, then another, as though whatever was moving was aware of us inside. I froze, listening. The sound stopped whenever I held my breath, and started again as soon as I exhaled. It moved around the barn slowly, steadily, always outside the beam of light from our flashlights. No snorts, no growls, no rustling of fur. Nothing that suggested a dog, a fox, or a deer. Just motion, subtle but consistent. I crouched low and pressed my back against the wall, watching the shadows through cracks in the wood. My friend didn't wake. I didn't want to shake him. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. The circling continued until just before dawn, when the steps finally faded away, leaving only the sound of ice cracking under the morning sun. We didn't speak. We packed our cameras and sleeping gear in silence, moving carefully so as not to disturb the frost that covered the ground. When we stepped outside, the full extent of what had happened hit me. The soil around the barn was frozen solid, yet there were deep impressions pressed into it. They were long and narrow, like elongated footprints, but unlike anything I had ever seen. Too many pressure points. Each step had left a strange, segmented pattern, like the weight had shifted unevenly across several appendages at once. The path circled the barn almost perfectly, continuing toward the edge of the frozen field before fading into the trees. My friend refused to photograph the impressions. He moved quickly through the property, checking the barns and the farmhouse again, muttering under his breath, but not stopping to examine the marks. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he expected to see something emerge from the woods. I followed him, hesitant to linger, and we loaded the car in near silence. On the drive back, neither of us said a word about what had happened. The forest on either side of the narrow road was dense, trees dark and bare against the low March sky. Our headlights cut through the fog that had begun to rise off frozen streams. But the silence in the car was heavier than the fog itself. When we finally reached the main road, the world felt normal again. The snow melting on asphalt, the occasional car passing, the faint smell of smoke from someone's chimney. But neither of us returned to that farm or mentioned it again. Later, I found out that my friend had deleted most of the photos we took. I never pressed him on why. Some questions don't need answers. The few images that remained showed broken windows, frost-covered barns, and the farmhouse slowly collapsing. Nothing unusual appeared in the pictures themselves, but the sense of weight of something having been there lingered in the shadows captured by the lens. I have thought about that night more than I should have. I think about how deliberate the movements were, how patient, how aware. There was no panic, no mistake, no animal instinct driving it. Whatever made those impressions understood the barn, the property, our presence, and how to move quietly around it. It never came inside, never made a sound within the walls, and yet it marked the frozen ground in a way I can't explain. I went back to urban life quickly after that trip. I kept photography, but my projects were limited to abandoned buildings within towns, industrial ruins, things that posed no risk. The idea of isolated properties in rural areas became unbearable. I can't imagine staying anywhere alone, far from roads, with nothing but wind and frost and fields to hide movement. That farm, that night, and those strange marks in the frozen soil left me with a clear understanding. Some places are not meant for visitors, not because of ghosts or legends, but because some things exist in the world that observe quietly, move deliberately, and leave their traces behind in ways that defy explanation. And sometimes, the safest action is to leave without interference, to respect the unknown presence, and to never return. I never returned. I don't think I will ever photograph abandoned properties in remote locations again. Some experiences aren't about proof or art. They're about survival, caution, and knowing when something is beyond your understanding. That winter in Eastern Europe reminded me of that. The barn, the circling, and the elongated prints in the frozen soil are burned into my memory. I can't explain them, but I know they were real. Whatever was there that night, it wasn't human and it wasn't an animal. It was something patient, precise, and aware, something that made sure we left before it revealed itself fully. And we left. That was the end of it. We never returned, never mentioned it to anyone else, and never tried to photograph such a place again. It's a lesson in patience, observation, and understanding that some things in the world operate on a different logic than ours, and there's nothing heroic about pushing past it. The farm sits empty still, frozen fields waiting for spring, barns standing like skeletons, and a quiet circle of earth marked forever by something that passed through and left its warning behind. I went to the farm as part of a volunteer program in May 2019. The goal was soil restoration on an old family-owned property in southern Missouri. The land had been inactive for decades. Row crops had stopped sometime in the late 1980s, and after that the place had been left alone except for occasional hunting leases that never lasted. The family still owned it, but lived out of state, and wanted to see if the soil could be brought back without heavy chemicals. That was the reason we were there. 5 volunteers, including me, signed up for 3 weeks of manual work and basic living conditions. The farm sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by low wooded hills. The fields were uneven and patchy, covered in weeds, briars, and thin grass. Old fence lines leaned inward, posts rotting at the base. There was a collapsed barn near the tree line, and a rusted tractor sunk halfway into the dirt behind it. No farmhouse, no neighbors close by. The nearest paved road was several miles away. We stayed in 3 old trailers parked near the edge of the main field. They had been hauled in years earlier for seasonal workers and never moved again. 2 people shared one trailer, 2 shared another, and 1 person stayed alone in the smallest one. I was in the middle trailer. The trailers were arranged in a loose half circle facing the field, with a gravel strip running between them. Beyond that was open ground and then woods. During the day the work was hard, but simple. We pulled invasive plants, spread compost, tested soil, and marked areas for erosion control. The sun baked the ground. The air smelled like clay and rot. Insects were constant. At night the place changed. Sound carried farther. The woods felt closer. The dark settled heavy in the valley, with no lights except what we used. The first few nights were normal. We cooked outside, cleaned tools, and went to sleep early. The trailers creaked as they cooled. Animals moved in the brush. Nothing stood out. On the 4th night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on gravel. Slow steps. Measured. They moved from one trailer toward another, then stopped. I lay still and listened. The steps started again, then stopped once more. I assumed someone was walking to the shared supply trailer. I went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. Same sound, same pace. The steps moved along the gravel strip between the trailers. When I shifted in bed, the sound stopped. I waited. After a long pause, the steps resumed, slower than before. I stayed still until they faded away toward the field. Over the next few nights, all of us noticed it. Footsteps moving between the trailers. Always late, always slow. Whenever someone turned on a light or looked out a window, the sound stopped immediately. We assumed it was one of us trying not to wake others. No one admitted to it, but no one was worried either. That changed when we started accounting for everyone. One night, the steps passed my trailer and stopped near the far one. I checked my phone. It was after midnight. I listened for doors opening or closing. Nothing. The steps resumed and circled back. In the morning, I checked with the others. Everyone said they had been asleep. No one had gotten up. One person thought maybe it was someone sleepwalking. Another thought it might be someone from the nearby woods, but there were no houses close enough to explain that. We began paying attention. The steps never ran. They never dragged. They sounded careful, like someone placing their feet deliberately. They followed the same path along the gravel strip, and sometimes stepped into the grass between the trailers. The timing was irregular, but frequent enough that it stopped feeling random. Then we found the footprints. It rained hard one night, enough to turn the dirt around the trailers into thick mud. In the morning, the ground was marked all around us. Bare footprints circled the trailers in overlapping loops. They did not lead away from the area. They did not come from the woods. They just appeared and moved around the trailers, then faded where the gravel began. The prints were wrong. The toes were long and spread wide. The heels were deep, deeper than they should have been for someone walking casually. The stride was uneven, sometimes short, sometimes stretched. It looked like someone shifting weight constantly. No shoes, no socks, just skin. We all stood there looking at them. No one claimed them. No one laughed. The prints did not match anyone's feet. We checked. The depths suggested more weight than any of us carried. After that, sleep became difficult. We kept lights on longer. We checked windows before bed. The footsteps continued. Sometimes they came close enough that the trailer shook slightly. Sometimes they stopped right outside a door. Always when someone moved or looked, the sound stopped. A few days later, equipment started going missing. Small things at first. A soil probe, a pair of gloves, a measuring tape. We assumed carelessness. Then items began reappearing. The soil probe showed up stacked neatly with other tools near the supply trailer, aligned carefully as if measured. The gloves appeared folded and placed on a crate. The measuring tape was coiled and set on top of a bucket that had been upside down the day before. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen permanently. Everything was handled. That was worse than theft. The footsteps changed after that. They came earlier in the night. They lasted longer. They circled wider, sometimes moving into the field. Once I heard them step onto the metal frame of my trailer, the weight shifting slowly, testing. The sound of skin on metal is something I still remember clearly. We documented everything. Footprints, missing items, times and patterns. The program coordinators were notified. They sent someone to inspect the site during the day. Nothing unusual was found. No camps, no signs of squatters. The woods showed no clear paths. The last night I stayed there, I did not sleep. I sat upright, light off, listening. The steps came just after midnight. They moved between the trailers, paused, then approached mine. They stopped inches from the door. I could hear breathing, slow, controlled. Then the steps backed away and moved toward the field. In the morning, we found more footprints. This time, they led to the collapsed barn. Inside, tools we had not used in days were stacked neatly on a dry beam, sorted by size and type. Someone had been inside during the rain without leaving more prints. That meant they knew the ground. They knew where to step. The program shut down early. Officially, it was due to safety concerns and equipment issues. Unofficially, no one wanted to stay another night. We packed up and left within 2 days. Weeks later, we learned the truth. A man had been living on the property for years without the family knowing. He was related distantly through a branch no one kept track of anymore. He had grown up there as a child before the land was abandoned. When the farm went inactive, he never left. He lived in the woods and used old structures for shelter. He avoided contact. He avoided roads. He walked barefoot to stay quiet and to feel the ground. He watched patterns. He moved only when he thought no one was looking. When the volunteer program arrived, he did not leave. He studied us instead. He moved equipment not to steal, but to understand. He stacked things because that was how he had always kept order. The footsteps stopped when people looked because he knew exactly how long it took for light to turn on or doors to open. Local authorities removed him after the shutdown. He did not resist. He had no criminal record, just years of isolation and attachment to land he believed was still his. Knowing that explanation did not make the memory easier. The fear came from understanding how close he had been, how long he had watched, and how careful he was not to be seen. The farm did not feel haunted. It felt occupied, and that was worse. I took over the sheep farm in early 2011 because I wanted something quiet and physical after years of desk work. The place sat in rural Scotland, far enough from the nearest village that fog often swallowed the road before I reached the gate. The listing was thin on detail. It said the land had fallen out of use after financial trouble and that the previous owner left when the costs outweighed the returns. No one spoke much about it. That suited me. I was not chasing history. I wanted land, stone buildings, and time. The farm spread across rolling pasture broken by low rises and shallow dips that held mist well into the day. Old stone barns stood in a loose cluster near the house. Sheep pens ran off from them in long lines of rotting wood and rusted wire. Everything felt worn but honest. The house was small and thick-walled, built to hold heat and shut out wind. Inside, it smelled of damp stone and old ash. I lived alone. I liked that at first. The first weeks passed without trouble. I cleared debris, mapped out repairs, and walked the boundaries. Fog came and went, sometimes lifting by mid-morning, sometimes staying low until evening. Sound carried strangely there. Footsteps felt louder. Distant movement felt close. I noticed bones early on, scattered in the fields and near the pens. That did not bother me. Sheep farms leave traces. Foxes and birds move things around. I assumed the land was still shedding its past. The bones near the house began to stand out after a month. They were too clean and too whole. Leg bones laid side by side. A spine section placed near the back door. No bite marks. No scatter pattern. I cleared them away more than once, tossing them into a ditch farther from the buildings. Days later, more appeared, sometimes the same types, sometimes skull fragments with teeth still set. There were no sheep left on the land. There had not been for years. There were no predators large enough to carry bones intact across open pasture. Foxes drag and chew. Birds scatter. This was neither. At night, the place changed. Fog pressed close to the windows, turning the outside into a flat wall. The house settled and creaked as stone does. Wind pushed through gaps I had not yet sealed. That was all normal. What cut through that normalcy was the sound outside the walls. Breathing, slow and controlled. Not loud, not frantic, close enough to hear the shape of it. When I shifted in bed or stood up, it stopped. When I stayed still, it returned after a time, steady and patient. I tested myself against it. I moved abruptly, made noise, opened doors. Each time, the sound was gone before I could place it. I found nothing outside but wet grass and fog. No tracks showed in the soft ground. The pasture around the house stayed smooth, untouched. I began sleeping lightly, waking often, listening more than resting. I told myself it was livestock from neighboring land, cattle moving close at night, their breath carrying through damp air. The explanation fit on paper. It did not fit the way the sound tracked my movement, stopping when I stopped, starting when I settled. Still, I held on to it because the alternative was harder to live with. The flattened ground near the barn appeared one morning just before spring. The fog had lifted early that day, leaving the grass dark and heavy with moisture. Near the long stone barn, a wide oval of grass lay pressed flat. The blades bent and matted, not trampled. The shape was too even for wind, too broad for a vehicle. It looked like something large had rested there for hours, its weight spread out, careful not to break the ground beneath it. I measured it with my steps. Wider than a car, longer than I was tall. There were no tracks leading to it or away from it. No dung, no hair, just the pressed grass and a faint warmth that lingered when I knelt. I stood there longer than I should have, feeling watched in open daylight. From that point on, the sense of presence followed me everywhere. In the fields, in the barns, even when the fog cleared and the land opened wide. I would feel a tension at my back, never sharp enough to locate. Tools went missing and turned up days later in odd places. Gates I knew I had closed stood open in the morning. Bones kept appearing, always closer to the house than before. I started keeping notes, not out of fear, but out of habit. Times, weather, locations, patterns formed slowly. The bones appeared after nights with heavy fog. The breathing followed days when I worked late near the barns. The flattened grass showed up after nights with no wind. All of it pointed to something physical, deliberate, and careful. The explanation came together in pieces, not all at once. I learned from a local paper that feral cattle had been pushed off nearby land years earlier when a neighboring farm shut down. A small group had taken to moving through open pasture at night, avoiding roads and lights. They were rarely seen during the day. People reported pressed grass, broken fences, and close encounters without clear sightings. Large animals learn routes. They learn cover. They learn to avoid attention. The bones fit then. Old sheep remained still surfaced from eroded ground and collapsed pens. Something large could pick them up, carry them without chewing, and drop them near shelter. The breathing fit a resting animal pressed close to a warm stone wall, lungs steady, aware of movement inside. The flattened oval fit a body bedding down near the barn, using it as a windbreak. The lack of tracks fit hard ground and careful movement along the same paths night after night. Knowing that did not bring relief. Feral cattle are unpredictable. They carry weight and momentum. They do not react well to surprise. Living alone among them, without clear boundaries or warning, wore on me. I stopped enjoying the work. I rushed tasks. I avoided certain areas at dusk. Sleep came in short stretches. I stayed 6 months because pride and money told me to. I left because my nerves told me to sooner than that. I put the property up for sale at a loss and accepted the first serious offer. On my last morning there, I walked the field one final time. Fog lay low, as it often did. Near the barn, the grass showed a faint depression from the night before. Fresh, wide, undeniable. I locked the house and drove away without looking back. The land was not cursed. It was not haunted. It was simply not empty, and it never had been. I had mistaken isolation for absence. The farm taught me the difference in ways that did not need imagination to be frightening. In August of 2003, my cousins and I went to my grandfather's goat farm in northern New Mexico to help repair fencing after a storm tore through the area. We were all adults by then, old enough to know the work and young enough to think nothing bad would happen with 4 of us together. The farm sat far from town, where the pavement gave way to dirt roads and the land opened in a dry scrub and low hills. The air smelled of dust and sage. The sky felt wide in a way that made sounds travel farther than they should. My grandfather had built the place himself decades earlier. The main house was plain and solid, set back from the goat pens and the fencing that ran along the edge of the property. Beyond that fence was open desert, broken only by shallow arroyos and scattered rock. There were no close neighbors. At night, the dark came down fast and clean, without light bleed from towns or highways. The first day passed without issue. We worked from morning until the heat forced us into shade, tightening wire, replacing posts, and clearing debris the storm had thrown against the fence. The goats stayed calm that day, moving around us with their usual stubborn interest. They knew the land and the routine. Their pens sat near the outer fence, where the pasture thinned and the desert began. That first night was quiet. We ate, cleaned up, and went to sleep early. The house creaked the way old houses do. The wind moved through the grass outside. Nothing felt off. The second evening, the goats changed. As the sun dropped and the light went flat and red, they gathered close together near the far side of the pen. They did not spread out to settle. They pressed shoulder to shoulder, heads up, bodies tight. Their bleating had an edge to it that I had heard before only when predators passed through. We checked the fence before dark and found nothing wrong. No breaks, no fresh tracks. The desert beyond the fence looked empty and still. We went inside when it got fully dark. The house lights threw yellow squares onto the yard. The rest of the land disappeared into shadow. The goats did not quiet down. They shifted and stomped, making the pen creak and rattle. Their noise carried through the open windows. Around midnight, we heard footsteps along the fence line. Not fast, not crashing, slow and heavy. Each step landed with weight, followed by a pause. Then another step. The sound came from the direction of the goat pens, moving along the outer fence. At first, I thought a bear. There had been reports of them moving through the area during dry years. The pace fit, the weight fit. Then the steps stopped and started again, going the other way, back and forth along the same stretch. No attempt to break through, no rush, just pacing. The sound of wire shifting slightly under pressure came and went. The goats pressed harder together, their noise rising and falling with the movement outside. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to judge how long it went on. The pacing did not stop after a few minutes. It went on for hours. The steps never moved away from the fence. They never approached the house. They stayed focused on that boundary, as if something on the other side mattered more than anything else. I lay awake, listening, trying to match the sound to an animal I knew. Bears move with purpose. They test, push, and then leave if they cannot get through. Coyotes are lighter, quicker, never that steady. This was neither. The pauses between steps felt measured, controlled. The sound of hands, not claws, brushing against wire came once soft but clear. The night cooled as it wore on. The pacing slowed, but did not stop until just before dawn. When the sound finally faded, it did not move off into the desert. It simply stopped. In the morning, we went out together. The light showed the land in sharp detail. Along the fence line, several sections were pressed down. Not broken, not cut. The wire bent inward in long, smooth curves, as if weight had been leaned against it over time. The posts stood but tilted slightly toward the pins. On the wooden posts themselves, we saw the impressions. Hand-shaped marks in the dust and weathered surface, set high. Too high for a child, taller than any of us remembered touching. The shape was clear enough to see fingers spread, the heel of a palm pressed in. There were no claw marks, no gouges, no hoof prints in the dirt below. Just boot prints leading up to the fence and then back away, shallow and careful, as if the person had stepped lightly to avoid leaving much behind. The explanation came slowly as the shock wore off and the details lined up. The area had seen an increase in border traffic that summer. People crossed the desert at night, following old routes, avoiding roads and lights. A goat farm at the edge of open land would draw attention. Animals meant water. Fencing meant a boundary worth testing. Someone had walked the fence, checking for weak spots, staying just out of sight, waiting for the goats to settle or for us to sleep deeper. The handprints made sense then. A person leaning in, listening, feeling the wire give, testing how much noise it made. The pacing fit a careful search, not an animal's frustration. The hours-long movement spoke to patience, not hunger. We finished the repairs that day without delay. We worked faster than planned, reinforcing the bent sections, adding wire, setting posts deeper. We did it all in full daylight, scanning the hills and the open ground beyond the fence. Nothing moved out there. The desert kept its distance. We did not stay another night. We loaded our things and left in the late afternoon, driving away while the sun was still high. The goats settled as we worked, their tension easing with the light and our presence. As we pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back at the fence line one last time. In the glare of the sun, it looked ordinary again, just wire and posts against open land. Years later, the memory stays sharp, not because of fear of the unknown, but because of how clear the cause became. Someone had been close, quiet, and patient, using the dark to measure a boundary and decide whether to cross it. The fence held. We were lucky that was enough. I took the job in June of 2009 because I needed cash fast and I did not have the leverage to ask questions. I had just come off a bad stretch of seasonal work and my savings were gone. The farm sat in southern Arizona, past a line of dry hills where the land turned rough and pale. Old mining roads cut through the area and stopped without warning. Rusted equipment lay half buried in the dirt. The produce farm itself looked tired, like it had been holding on longer than it should have. The owner paid me in cash at the end of each week. He did not ask for my name beyond what he needed to write on a scrap of paper. I did not ask about permits or inspections. I just showed up before sunrise and worked until the heat pushed me off the fields. Most days I worked alone. The irrigation lines were old, patched many times, and ran across uneven ground. Some were buried shallow, and some lay exposed. Leaks were common. I spent hours crouched in the dirt, cutting, fitting, and sealing under a sky that stayed cloudless. The farm grew a mix of produce that never looked like it thrived. The soil was thin and salty. The wind carried grit that stuck to sweat. There was a farmhouse near the center of the property, one story, faded white, with a porch that sagged on one side. I never saw anyone use it. The windows stayed dark. The only movement around the place came from me and the wind. Scarecrows stood at the edges of the fields and near the barn. They were rough things made from old shirts and pants stuffed with hay. Their heads were burlap sacks tied with twine. They did not look like decorations. They looked like tools that had been thrown together without care. At first, I paid them little attention. They blended into the land the way broken fence posts did. After a week or so, I noticed one had shifted. It stood closer to the farmhouse than I remembered. I assumed the owner had moved it to keep birds away from a different row. The next day, another one had turned. It faced the house instead of the field. That caught my eye, but I still shrugged it off. Farms change small things all the time. As the days passed, the changes became harder to ignore. Scarecrows that had stood at the far ends of the property appeared closer to the center. Their spacing no longer followed the rows. Some faced inward, their burlap heads angled toward the farmhouse and the barn. One stood near the dirt road that led in from the highway, as if watching the approach. None of the moves made sense for crop protection. I started checking them when I arrived, then again when I left. I never saw them move. They were always different in the morning. The heat grew worse as June went on. I arrived earlier to get work done before the sun climbed too high. The quiet of those mornings pressed on me. No birds called near the fields. The only sound came from my boots in the dirt and the faint hiss of water in the lines. One morning, I noticed marks behind the barn. The barn sat a short distance from the fields, its boards gray and splintered. The ground behind it showed long grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged away. The marks ran straight for several yards and then disappeared into harder ground. I knelt and looked closer. There were no tire tracks, no hoof prints, no palm marks, just deep lines and disturbed soil. The dirt there was packed and dry, not the kind that takes impressions easily. Whatever made those marks had weight. I checked the area again later that day. Nothing else stood out. No broken boards, no discarded tools. The barn door stayed shut, held by a chain and padlock that looked old but solid. I told myself it could have been equipment moved with a skid or dragged by a truck that never left clear tracks. The explanations felt thin, but I held on to them because I needed to keep working. The scarecrows continued to change. One morning I found two of them positioned close together near the farmhouse, both facing the porch. Their clothes were stiff with dirt and sun. One had an arm that hung lower than before, as if the twine had loosened. I felt a tightness in my chest when I saw them like that. It felt wrong to have those shapes watching the empty house. I walked the property more carefully after that. I checked the doors of the farmhouse. They were locked. The windows were intact. No signs of entry showed. The barn stayed closed during the day. I began to notice smaller details. Footprints near the irrigation lines that were not mine, pressed deep where the soil was soft from leaks. They were not clear enough to read well, but they looked like boot prints, heavy and worn. I told myself they could be old, left by the owner or someone else weeks before. I avoided thinking about how fresh they looked. On my last scheduled day, I arrived earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, with a faint line of light over the hills. The air felt cooler, heavy with the smell of dust and plants. As I drove in, my headlights swept across the barn. The doors were open. The chain hung loose, one end still wrapped around the handle. I stopped the truck and sat for a moment with the engine running. The open doors did not fit with anything I'd seen before. The owner never opened them during the day. I shut off the engine and stepped out. Inside the barn, the air smelled sharp and stale. The light from the doorway fell across the walls and the floor. Deep scratches marked the wood on the inside walls, running at shoulder height and above. They were not random. They formed long gouges, as if something hard had been dragged along the boards with force. Some boards were splintered. Others had fresh wood showing through the gray surface. The floor was scuffed and scraped. More drag marks led out the back, deeper than the ones I'd seen before. I stood there longer than I should have. My skin prickled despite the cool air. The damage did not look like animals. It looked like work done by someone strong, careless, and in a hurry. I backed out of the barn and walked around it. The drag marks ended near the tree line, where the ground turned rocky and uneven. Beyond that lay the old mining land, cut with pits and shafts that dropped out of sight. I did not see the owner that day. I waited longer than usual, sitting in the truck with the windows down, watching the farmhouse and the road. No one came. The scarecrows stood in their inward-facing positions, unmoving in the early light. I felt watched by things that should not watch anything. Not because they were alive, but because someone had placed them that way for a reason. I did not finish the day's work. I gathered my tools, loaded them into the truck, and drove to the farmhouse one last time. I checked around the porch and the yard. More footprints showed in the dust, leading away from the house toward the hills. They did not return. I understood then that the owner had not been tending crops the way a normal farmer would. The cash payments, the lack of records, the isolated land near abandoned mines all pointed to something else. The scarecrows were not for birds. They were markers. The drag marks were not accidents. They were traces of things moved under cover of night. I left the farm before the sun cleared the hills. I drove straight into town, packed what little I had, and moved on the same afternoon. I never returned to that area. Months later, I heard through a second-hand source that the farm had been shut down. No explanation was given. The land was listed for sale and never moved. I do not know what exactly happened there, but I know the signs of people doing work they do not want seen. I know the look of places used and abandoned in a hurry. That farm was not haunted. It was used, then left behind when the risk grew too high. I am still grateful I noticed the changes before I stayed long enough to be part of whatever pulled those heavy things through the dirt at night. I went to the farm because my uncle asked me to watch it while he recovered from surgery. It was late October 2014, harvest already finished, the field shaved down to stubble and dirt. The land sat in eastern Nebraska, where the ground stays flat long enough that the sky feels wider than it should. The farm had been in my family since the 1940s. I grew up visiting it for holidays and summer work, but I had never stayed there alone. The farmhouse sat far from the road, a low white structure with peeling trim, surrounded by empty fields and an old windbreak of dying trees that creaked even when there was no wind. At night, the place felt exposed. There were no nearby houses. The nearest highway was miles away, just a faint glow on the horizon. I arrived in the afternoon with groceries, feed, and a toolbox. The air smelled like cut stalks and damp soil. The silence felt clean. I walked the fences before dark, checking the cattle gates and the wire along the east field where the ground dipped toward a shallow drainage ditch. Everything looked normal. The cattle were calm. I locked the farmhouse, turned on a few lights, and slept hard that first night. The first few days passed without trouble. I fed the cattle in the mornings, checked water tanks, and kept the place tidy. At night, I cooked simple meals and listened to the radio. The quiet felt earned. The windbreak trees rattled after sunset. Coyotes yipped far off, never close. I checked the gates every evening before bed, out of habit more than concern. I had done farm work long enough to know that open gates meant problems. On the third morning, I found the south cattle gate unlatched. It was still closed, resting against the post, but the chain hung loose. I knew I had latched it the night before. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at the chain, the mud around the post, the trampled grass where the cattle had gathered. I told myself it was my mistake. Fatigue does that. I latched it again and moved on. The next morning, the east field gate was unlatched too. That one bothered me. The cattle had bunched up away from it, pressed toward the center of the field. They kept their distance like there was something wrong with the ground itself. I walked the fence line and found no breaks. No tire tracks. No obvious sign of damage. The mud near the gate showed prints, but the ground was churned from hooves, nothing clean enough to read. I latched the gate and made a note to be more careful. That night the wind dropped and the moon came up bright. The stubble reflected pale light. I turned off the house lights early and sat by a window for a while, looking out across the fields. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement low in the east field. At first it looked like shadows sliding between rows. Then the shapes rose higher, too tall for coyotes. They moved on two legs but stayed bent over, dropping back down when the distant glow of headlights swept the horizon from the highway. The movement was steady, controlled, not panicked. Whoever it was knew the timing of passing cars. I stayed still and watched until the shapes slipped into the darker edge near the windbreak. I slept poorly after that. In the morning, the cattle refused to go near the east field. They crowded the opposite fence and paced. I checked the gate. It was unlatched again. The chain had been set back over the post like someone had taken care to leave it looking normal. I followed the fence line toward the ditch and found clearer prints in the wet soil. There were hoof prints, but they were wrong. stretched, uneven, deeper on one side like weight had shifted suddenly. Mixed between them were bare footprints. Human feet, flat and pale in the mud, toes spread wide. Some prints showed heel strikes like someone had been walking fast. Others were half-moon smears where feet had slid. It made no sense to see them together. I walked back to the house and checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing inside was disturbed. No food missing. No tools gone. That was worse than theft. It meant whoever was out there was careful. I told myself it could be hunters cutting across land without permission, but the barefoot prints argued against that. The timing at night argued against that too. The next evening I latched every gate with fresh wire and marked the posts with chalk so I could see if they moved. I parked my truck facing the east field and left the headlights off, keeping the keys close. I sat inside with the engine cold, watching the moonlight spread across the ground. Around the same time as before, movement started again. 2 shapes this time, maybe 3. They stayed low, moving in short bursts. When a car passed on the highway, they dropped flat, pressed into the dirt until the light faded, then rose again. I could see the outline of shoulders, the swing of arms kept tight to bodies. I could not see faces. They went to the gate. I watched the chain lift and settle without a sound. The cattle shifted and snorted, pulling away. One shape stepped into the field. Another stayed near the fence, scanning. The ground near the ditch was darker with moisture, and when they crossed it, the prints formed clearly. One person wore boots, so worn the soles had split, leaving elongated marks that looked wrong at a glance. Another was barefoot. That explained the mix. The hoof prints came from cattle spooked into sudden movement, dragging and twisting as they turned away from the gate. Nothing supernatural, just fear and weight and mud. I did not confront them. I stayed in the truck and waited until they moved back toward the windbreak. When they were gone, I drove out to the gate. The wire was cut clean. The chalk marks were disturbed. I latched it again and backed the truck away, heart steady but heavy. I understood then that staying in the house put me too far from escape. The fields offered no cover. The distance to the road worked both ways. I stayed one more night. I slept in my truck with the doors locked and the seat laid back, parked near the driveway where I could leave fast. I kept the engine cold to avoid noise. Nothing came close to the house that night. Just movement far off near the ditch, brief and controlled. At first light, I drove the fence line one last time. The east field gate was unlatched again. Fresh prints crossed the mud, heading toward a culvert onto the county road. That told me where they were staying. I left before dawn and drove straight to town. I contacted the county sheriff and gave a full report. They checked the area later that day. A few days after I left, they found 2 men living in the culvert with tarps and stolen feed sacks. They had been moving at night to avoid traffic, cutting gates to access water and cattle, taking grain from bins across multiple properties. One had ditched his boots because the soles had split and made noise. They had been sleeping during the day and watching the highway for patterns. They were arrested and removed. My uncle hired someone local to watch the place until he recovered. I did not go back alone. The explanation fit every detail. The gates, the timing, the prints, the cattle behavior. Knowing what it was did not make the nights easier in memory. The land had stayed the same since the 1940s, flat and open, with nowhere to hide. That was the problem. It let anyone see everything, including you, long before you knew they were there. I went to the dairy farm because it was cheap and I needed a place fast. It was my second year of college, fall semester of 2017, and campus housing had filled early. I was short on money and long on confidence. The listing said quiet, rural, and private. It did not say abandoned, but that became clear the moment I arrived. The farm sat several miles from the nearest town, surrounded by flat land broken by drainage ditches and narrow gravel roads. Cornfields bordered the property on 2 sides. The rest was open pasture that had gone to weeds. The dairy operation had shut down years earlier. The owner no longer lived there. He rented out the main house and a small outbuilding that had once been used for storage. I lived alone. The house was old but solid. It smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The plumbing worked. The heat worked. That was enough for me. The milking barn sat a short distance from the house, long and low, built from wood and corrugated metal. Its doors were closed, but not locked. I could see the rusted stalls through gaps in the boards. The first few nights were quiet. I studied during the evenings and went to bed early. The silence felt heavy but clean, the kind that presses on your ears. At night, the temperature dropped hard. I could hear the barn responding to it, metal popping and wood shifting as it cooled. Those sounds did not bother me. I grew up around farms. Buildings make noise when they settle. It felt normal. The lights started during my second week. I woke up around 2 in the morning without knowing why. The house was dark and still. I lay there for a moment, listening. Then I saw it through the bedroom window. A brief flash inside the barn. It was not steady. It did not spill out through the doors. It lit the interior for a split second and vanished. I sat up and watched. After a short pause, another flash. Same place. Same quick burst. It reminded me of someone walking with a flashlight, covering it with their hand. I told myself it was a reflection, maybe a car on the road. I got out of bed and moved to the window that faced the driveway. No headlights passed. The road was empty. I waited longer. The light flashed again, deeper inside the barn. It did not move across the walls. It blinked on and off, irregular. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear yet. It felt like confusion trying to turn into concern. The next morning I walked over to the barn in full daylight. The grass around it was flattened from years of use, but nothing looked disturbed. Inside, the place was dead. Old equipment sat where it had been left. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs stretched between the beams. I checked the walls for wiring. The power lines to the barn had been cut long ago. No breakers, no lights, no outlets. There was no way for the barn to light up on its own. I stood there longer than I needed to, then went back to the house and tried to forget about it. The lights came again the next night. Same time, same pattern, short bursts, never long enough to clearly show a shape. I did not go outside. I watched from the window and felt my pulse in my ears. The flashes stopped after a few minutes. The barn went dark and stayed dark. I slept poorly after that. During the day, everything felt normal again. The sun flattened the land and stripped it of mystery. I walked the property and found no signs of anyone else. No vehicles, no footprints that did not belong to me. I checked the outbuilding and the house. All doors were locked. Nothing was missing. I told myself that if someone were using the barn, I would see signs. That belief helped me stay another night. The manure appeared during my third week. I stepped out of the house one morning and smelled it before I saw it. Fresh, strong, unmistakable. Near the entrance to the barn, someone had piled manure neatly against the wall. It was not scattered. It was stacked like it had been shoveled. There were no animals on the property. The fields were empty. The pile had not been there the day before. I stood there, staring at it, feeling the cold soak through my shoes. I walked around the barn and found shallow tracks in the dirt. Boot prints pressed deep. They led toward the road and disappeared where the gravel began. I followed them until I lost them, then stood there exposed and small, listening to the wind move through the weeds. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, the lights returned. They came sooner this time. I watched from the living room window, every muscle tight. The flashes seemed closer to the doors. I imagined someone inside, working by feel, careful not to stay lit long enough to be seen. I did not call anyone. I did not go outside. I waited until the lights stopped and morning came. I broke the lease that week. I told the owner I was leaving and did not wait for a response. I packed my car in daylight and left the keys on the counter. I drove back to campus and slept on a friend's floor until I found a room. For months after, I slept with the lights on, not because I thought something followed me, but because darkness had learned how to hold my attention too well. Later, I put the pieces together in a way that made sense. The farm sat close to other active operations. Manure is valuable. People steal it to fertilize fields. Someone had been using the abandoned barn as cover, storing manure overnight and hauling it out before dawn. The flashes were from a battery-powered flashlight, shielded to avoid drawing attention. The neat pile was work done by someone who knew what they were doing. The lack of other signs meant they were careful. That explanation should have made me feel better. It did not. Knowing that someone had been there night after night while I slept alone in that house Watching the same land I thought was empty left a mark. The fear was not in the unknown. It was in how ordinary the reason turned out to be. Someone had been close, unseen, and had no reason to care whether I was there or not. That knowledge followed me longer than the lights ever did.